moment, for one thing, because this was also the moment of nation formation. The idea of the ulema as a consolidated fraternity was emerging, and something to bind the entire ulama of the country was the need of the time. And the Muslim community as such responded to it very positively, and this particular response resulted in the Muslim Sharia Act, which came up in 1937, which was followed by a whole lot of supplementary rules or supplementary reforms. 1937 Sharia Application Act and the Muslim Dissolution of Marriage Act of 1939. These were laws that specifically applied to Muslim. And around this period, along the line of women empowerment and along the line of questions raised related to gender, there was also the 1929 Child Marriage Restraint Act, which came up. So this was actually the moment in which legal reforms were happening in terms of gender concerns. What is interesting at this point is to look back into the late 19th century reforms which happened in Bengal, and many of us are familiar with Partha Chatterjee's readings. At least some of us are familiar with Partha Chatterjee's readings of these reforms in the name of women which happened in Bengal in the 19th century. And Partha Chatterjee thinks that in the late 19th century what happened in Bengal was a whole lot of discourse. The entire discursive terrain of nationalism in the late 19th century was based on the question of gender. The sati, widow remarriage, and a whole lot of the appeal was to the state, the appeal was to the modern Indian, the appeal was to the nation as such to take up reform. So the educated Indian modern man cannot take this pressure of his partner or his mother or his sister being treated in such a manner. And the question of gender, which was completely which was so much predominant in the public sphere of the time, kind of disappeared according to Partha Chatterjee in the early 20th century. He thinks that this disappearance happened because the nationalists resolved the women's question by dividing the engagement of nationalism in two spheres. One is the public sphere, or the public, the outside of the nation, and the other one is the spiritual interior of the nation. So women's question has to be resolved within the interiors of the nation by trying to identify a particular image of Indian women, especially the upper caste Hindu woman, as the face of Indian women, and by saying that she will be the guardian of the home, and outside the man will go out, the modern man, he will have contestations with colonial modernity, but at the same time he will also enjoy the privileges of colonial modernity in terms of modern education, etc., etc. So this contentious space is reserved for men, whereas solving this question of nationalist resolution of women's question in some way created resulted in the disappearance of women's question from the public after a particular point. Now, if we look further, I would also want you to look at the kind of questions and the engagements with law reforms, especially during the early 20th century. It's not that the women's question disappeared altogether. If you look at the nationalist movement, a whole lot of women joined the nationalist movement in the early 20th century. Gandhi and a whole lot of women, as per Gandhi's call, responded to the movement, the movement for independence. Likewise, in regions where the communist movement was predominant, you see a large engagement of women in the communist movement, especially in places like Kerala and Andhra. You can see women's participation in the communist movement. And also this is the time when law reforms came up as a question in terms of gender. So women, as part of All India Women's Congress and also as part of various movements at this particular point, demanded a reform of Hindu laws, demanded a reform of Muslim laws in terms of a kind of gender consciousness, and the question of women's empowerment was coming up. And at this particular point in the 1920s, as a response, when realizing this mass movement of women into the public domain, you see RSS responding to this particular moment by forming the Rashtra Sevika Samiti. Because they also felt that this mobilization of women and the movement of women towards the public sphere is in some way going to affect the notions of age-old sanctity of Indian women and all that. So in some ways, this was a moment, this was a medley of like a conundrum of all sort, where you have different kinds of questions coming up about women. And this particular moment is very important in the not just in terms of this particular moment is not just important in terms of legal reforms. This is also the moment of nation formation. And if you read most of these cultural theorists who work along the lines, you also see this is also the time when nation determined its margins. And since I said, like in the beginning, 1937 or the Sharia Application Act or the later Muslim Women's Marriage Dissolution Act, all these did not come across with kind of resistance from the community. But post-partition, what happened to this kind of an urge for reform? And this question, I don't think the onus of this question should be placed on the Muslims of India. The onus of this question should be placed on the mainstream. Why the entire engagement with legal reform was in some ways marginalized, kept aside for larger questions related to the status of Muslims in India, for the fate of Muslims in India, for the kind of living standards, the kind of questions that Muslims raise at this particular moment related to the Sacha Committee report, all these things, these are the pertinent questions before Indian Muslim at the moment. And I feel legal reforms or personal law reforms, if it got sidelined, it is also because of the erosion of power from the Indian Muslim post-partition. Erosion of power, I'm not talking in the very statist notion of power, but post-partition, with the formation of Pakistan, when the nation also determined its borders, its cartographic boundaries, there is also the binary of the other, the Muslim, where even now, like, in all these discourses you hear, if you cannot do this, you go to Pakistan. So without thinking about Pakistan as the other, this nation cannot exist. And precisely that is the reason why, and whoever would not fit into this mainstream homogenized notion of nationalism will be thrown to Pakistan. Pakistan thus becomes a kind of place where we can discard. It can be a neighbor, it won't be us. It's not this nation. And every moment in the history of every Indian Muslim, one's status, one's loyalty, one's convictions, all these will be determined and designed by the existence of this other or the outside, or whatever we call it, the margin, the notion of Pakistan as a neighbor, something that cannot be contained within the nation. I'm not trying to be provocative, but I also feel that it is the truth and we have to address it, and it has to be said at many points. So now, like in the moving on to this question of secularism, democracy, and the idea of uniform rights, I also want to bring your attention to the kind of questions that emerge in post-secularist mode of thinking, where secularism is no longer a kind of like, secularism and liberalism is no longer the sunny formulation which we can all go and hug and be happy ever after. It is a kind of, we have realized that modern secularism has its own drawbacks, and living as a Muslim in India, if not the Muslims, who else would realize what are the hidden I would say pits, or like the hidden pitfalls in our concept of secularism. Living in a terrain of, so when we talk about uniformity of rights, what are the kind of uniform civil rights we are talking about? we also dwell, or we also occupy a space which talks about the collective conscience when a judgment has to be given, something that would appease the collective conscience of the nation. So justice, in that sense, what is the human right and justice that we are addressing is a very pertinent question, and we cannot evade the responsibility. As modern Indian citizen, we have to think about the responsibility of being this particular living in this particular moment as Muslims in India, as modern citizens in India. Okay, I was talking about the idea of secularism, and I was talking about the fissures in our practices of secularism, not just in terms of and I also want to say that along with the post-secular thinkers, our practices of secularism is flawed, not just because there is some other ideal notion of secular state. It is also a concept. For instance, people like Talal Azad and later many others who have worked on the idea of secularism, they also see this as an ontological question. It is an epistemological question. It is not a question in terms of the practice of secularism. It's not a fissure in our practice.